2, and 3. Remember the old V for victory? That was the main one, and then later on another 2-cent one and another 3-cent one. My wife was in 4-H, and she went around and gave demonstrations how to make a sugarless cake. That sounds not like kissing your sister, doesn't it? A sugarless cake, but you really like cake. But here's her recipe. And she got that out for me. I asked her, and lo and behold, she made it this afternoon. And I had some of it for supper. And it's like a wet cat. It wasn't as bad as it looked. But now then, I'll go just a little bit modern. Right now, these stamps are on sale at the post office. And you get a nice book from the post office, and these are 29-cent stamps. I'm going to put just a little bit closer to me. This one here, for instance, like the Burma Road, the peacetime draft, the sport, Churchill, Roosevelt, and all of these. And then we come down to 1942, and you begin to see how things has changed here. And we see the different, here's the women who worked in the factories, and the Japanese invaded Aleutian Islands. And this is the one that just came out recently in 1943, and it talks about the German subs here and the military medics, giving different people credit. Here's the stamps that I just showed you. And then it came, after the Second War, it came the Korean War. And there was no a Korean stamp except this one here that you put out. And then we got 2000, we got the Vietnam War. And ironically, the Vietnam veterans were not honored until they made one a picture of the memorial wall at Arlington Cemetery. And they finally got around to that. Ray Bossy in here, Ray said they've been trying for 2 years to get to honor the paratroopers. And maybe they'll get around to it. But here's the Desert Shield. Didn't take long to get that stamp. And remember, everyone that was in service got the button with the circle. They made a stamp for that. Here's a sinking of the Dorchester, the 4 chaplains. I heard one of the survivors, not a chaplain, of course, but one of the survivors is clerking in the Air Force and how he survived. And that troop ship, they lost more men on that troop ship than any other troop ship that was sunk during the war. It was sunk the frigid waters off of New England, and men only lasted a few minutes. Men died down with the ship rather than to jump in that cold water, for they knew that it was death either way. And out of it, before it was over with, it came the United Nations stamp. If I were you, had a little money to spend, I'd buy these 3 and put them away.
That Dorchester, that Chaplain Fox on there, one of the 4 chaplains, he left my outfit to volunteer for that.
They are making a memorial for them somewhere, and there's been a stained glass that has that.
Keep some of these around, maybe ask some questions.
All right. That there, Don, I hope I didn't get into your atomic bomb, which...
I don't even know where he's at.
there he is.
Well, thank you, Marion. And we'll ask some more questions later. Maybe Marion has some displays out here, and we can go through it. And what history? I'm going to help me carry this, Steve.
I'll have these at the fair. Ironically, I won't be there because my wife and I buy these senior citizen books with 2 round trips, same place in the United States. We've got kids scared out and hadn't planned on this, but we've got our tickets and everything planned to be gone to California during Fair Week. I'm glad some of you fellas are here this evening. You might explain that. I'm going to kind of turn it over to Gene. Gene, I'll see that Denver gets them there. If you'll see that they'll get it hung up or something, displayed. Yeah, at the fair.
Oh,
We'll take
that
care
guy
of it.
back there is in charge of that.
Okay, I got one other thing before Don says anything. This is for the women, and I imagine you'll recognize what this is. I knew it. I think I heard somebody let the cat out of the bag. What are they? Joanne Bossy made this apron. And some of these are Lois's, and some of them are Joanne's. And all the men hated them at the feast, or the women would come in and get one and they didn't have enough. I want that sack on the bottom, and then have to move. But this is the material. You see, our hemp was sewed up when Japan got Philippine Islands, and this I hope will be on display too.
Thank you, Marion. You know, wonderful. What a display and quite history. Thanks again. Say something real quick about our next Nostalgia Night.
Sure. Well, first, I never got to welcome everybody to the library. I'm Sue Preifel, your library director, and thanks for coming. I hope you can come again on Monday, July 12th, right, at 7 o'clock again. And our Doc Bueller, right?
Doc
So
Bueller
far.
and
So far.
Christabella. Christabella was secretary on the draft board. That'll be very interesting. Very interesting.
If anybody wants some coffee and a cookie, it's back in the back.
Our next speaker was born and, like Marion, continues to reside on a farm in western Rush County, although Marion's kind of the northern end of the county. Enlisted in the Army in 1943, and he, along with a handful of men, were selected to work in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers at Los Alamos, New Mexico, to build the world's first atomic bomb. He became the man who triggered the explosion on the first atomic bomb on July 16, 1945, and was one of the first two people in the history of the world to see, with unprotected eyes, an atomic bomb explosion. Help me welcome Don Miller, please.
Thank you very much. We're local people. Sue and I live down around Moscow, and we just finished a 3-day festival, so we look a little bush from that. We did it in 1941, and we had a teacher there, the name of Mrs. Jackman. I'm sure John Carter here remembers Mrs. Jackman. She was a history teacher, and she thought we ought to know all about current events. I don't think I was very much interested in current events, even though World War II was brewing, and I don't know. One of those old magazines that we took had a picture of a battleship. I remember it said this was the largest battleship in the world in Japan. It was called the Nagato. I'm going to tell you tonight how I finally sent on the guns of that Nagato 5 years later. Operations Crossroads in Bikini, and what happened to me on the way to do that. Anyway, after Melroy, I went to engineering school at Tri-State College. The war was brewing. I remember exactly what I was doing in the Pearl Harbor strike. I was drawing a screw jack out of Fritz's drawing book on the drawing board, and I remember exactly what I was drawing. That's how important it was with all of us in college. It wasn't long before most of my friends were in the service, and we were all getting pretty patriotic, but we wanted to stay in college. So finally, we had our choice of joining a reserve group, and I joined a reserve signal corps group with the idea that I'd get to choose the branch of service I went in. After we did this, it seemed like almost immediately we were called up, and after a few problems, I was inducted at Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indianapolis. We got on the troop train, and I was heading for Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, where the Signal Corps had its main headquarters. They changed trains, changed cars at Cincinnati, and it kept getting warmer and warmer and warmer. And it wasn't long, I realized I was in Biloxi, Mississippi, the Air Corps. Either in the wrong car or the wrong train or something. So here I was in the Air Corps without any orders or papers, and I didn't get paid much either. And so I couldn't find out where I was supposed to go. Army was all snapped up. Anyway, I started taking basic training, and before long I realized that the Air Corps only had 6 weeks basic training. I found out that Fort Monmouth, the Signal Corps, had regular infantry basic, which was about 90 days, soon to be 17. I thought, well, I don't want to do that. So went down to headquarters one day, and on the paper, on the bulletin board, was something called ASTP, Army Specialized Training Program. And the more I read, I couldn't believe it. Here at the Army had taken me out of college, and looked like this piece of paper was going to put me back in college. So being a gambler, I thought, I'm going to sign up for this. So I did. It wasn't very long before I was up decide where everybody was going. This was called the Star Unit. The Star Unit was just what it was. They were putting men who had been in college, engineers, back in various universities, and the Army was trying to accelerate their training. And I wound up at Ohio State. Turned out there was about 150,000 soldiers pulled out of the regular Army units and sent to at least 10 universities around the country. And there was 15,000 of us at Ohio State. We marched to class. There was no English or history or sociology in the curriculum. They were all physics, chemistry, and engineering subjects. I remember that we took a course in servo mechanisms, which was almost a secret word. We had one guy with a photographic memory. We were allowed to take notes. And we had an empty period after this, and we used him to get a set of notes so we get good grades. We realized that getting grades was important. It was important because the 15,000 in about 6 months was down to 150. Now, that's a pretty high casualty rate at the university. We didn't know what was happening to these people. We heard a couple hung themselves, and we didn't know why we were at the university. My father was pretty worried because the FBI had been questioning him, talking to the preacher, talking to various people around schools about me. And while I was at Ohio State, I made some real good friends. I looked around and said, who got the best grades in class? It was always the Jewish boys. It wasn't only the Jewish boys, it was the German Jewish boys. Now, how did German Jewish boys get in the Army, and how did they get to Ohio State? Well, in 1939, Hitler ran all the Jewish families of any importance out of Germany. These were the kids of these refugees who had become citizens and had a real vengeance to get in the Army and do something about Hitler. They're all very smart, and they knew that grade was important. So I guess my middle name became Goldstein or something because I seemed to have a lot of Jewish friends. This went on for about 9 months, and it looked like we were going to graduate out of ASTP. And we were interviewed. I had no idea what the purpose of it was. We were interviewed. I now think back, and a big fat general, who I think was General Groves, talked to me. And some of the things he found out, which he liked. I was a pretty good student. I wasn't the best in class, but I was a good student. I was a ham radio operator. I talked about radio when everybody gave me a chance. I'm still a ham radio operator. And he was pretty interested, and he said, well, we'll talk to you later. We graduated, and they called a bunch of us back in again, and they said, we're going to give you 3 or 4 days to go home and get your life in shape, make out a will, make out a power of attorney, you're going on a mission. My father thought we were going to be occupation troops in Germany after the war, but the number was so small that we had no idea. They called all 6 of us in. The first 5 rejected because they had relatives in Germany. Guess who was number 6? Don Goldstein Miller. And so we had our orders to go to some secret place, and it turned out to go bridge. They locked us in a barracks. There was a ping pong table, brought the food to us, and there I found some of the people I'd seen a year or so before down in the University of Alabama. They had gone to other universities, and now were being grouped at Oak Ridge and being interviewed very intensely about all kinds of things, mostly patriotism. So one day we got orders to ship out. I had no idea where we were going. I called my folks and I said, we're on our way. They thought we were going overseas. Got on the train, we rode for days, and after many days' travel, we stopped out in the middle of what looked like a desert. I looked out and I saw a sign on the railroad station that said, Miami, New Mexico. Just in the last year or so, I refound that railway station. I never knew where it was at. They backed the big truck up, and a few of us that were on the train were secretly put into this truck and hauled for an hour or so over bumpy roads. And we realized we were going into town, but we didn't know where we were at. We later found out that we were in San idea what we were doing. They fed us, it was breakfast time, they gave us canteen food. Lotus, more of us, it was a grouping from various universities. We all asked each other, what are we doing here? Had no idea. They hauled us up a mountain. Turned out that mountain was about 7,200 feet. Just came back from that mountain after a 5-day party celebrating the 50th anniversary of the ERA. Anyway, they interviewed us again. It's sort of surprising. The military sort of disappeared. I was being interviewed by civilians. And as what my interest was, again, I'm in amateur radio, electrical engineering, and put in barracks, all of us. There's about 150 of us grouped there in barracks at Los Alamos. And we didn't know what it was. The next day, we went up to the laboratory, and again, civilian scientists, who we now know were scientists, interviewed us, and we were chosen to work in a lab. And I worked with a gentleman by the name of William Higginbotham, who became rather famous later on. I sat and talked to Willie a couple of weeks ago. He's about 80 years old now, still kicking, and he was my boss the entire time I was at Los Alamos. What I worked on was mostly fusing circuits and making measurements of something like gamma rays and alpha particles, which I really knew very little about. I'm an electrical engineer, not a physicist. But it wasn't long before we'd seen pictures and encyclopedias, and when Niles Bohr walks down the aisle, you sort of recognize him. And then there was this guy with this floppy hat, what he called Oppie. And people like that, we knew in physics at all. We knew we were seeing a group of very famous people concentrated in a small area. As you all know, Los Alamos was a boys' ranch. And several famous people like Groves, Farrell, Oppenheimer, and Fermi chose this place because of the isolation. It's on top of a very extinct volcano. And I had the pleasure, so I went out and saw the crater, which is maybe 30 or 40 miles across. And when the lava came out of the crater, a big explosion, supposed to be the biggest explosion ever occurred on the Earth 1 million years ago, it formed great streams of lava, and Los Alamos was built on one of these wings of lava. You never know that except we took an airplane picture. I brought one home, and I never really knew what it looked like before. We had 2 fences around Los Alamos. We had to have passes to go in and out. We weren't allowed out much. We were told that they would probably shoot us, court-martial us, or talk to anybody, tell our folks we were overseas or had a PO number. And any letters we wrote would be read, not to seal them. They would be read going out, and all letters coming in would be read. Letters coming in read. I remember getting some letters either from Sue or my parents that used scissors on them and cut out great lines. I often wondered what those things said. Apparently it was some question of, what are you doing down? Tell me about it. Well, about 3 months went by, and everybody was saying, I wonder what we're doing here. We didn't really know what we really want to talk about. And went in and asked Willie one day, I said, Willie, can you tell me what we're doing? And Willie said, what physics book did you study out of? And I said, I read out, studied out of by Hausman Slack, a very famous physics book in the early 40s. Everybody studied out of it. I said, how far did you get in the book? Oh, I said, about 2/3 of the way through. I said, did you ever read the last chapter? I said, you go home and read it. I did. It talked about some very early experiments that were being done in Germany by Meitner and Fermi and people like that, indicating that fission was possible. And with fission, you get tremendous releases of energy. And I knew we were working on some kind of nuclear device. It was never mentioned again. I never heard anybody openly talk about an A-bomb while I was in Los Alamos. It was always working on the gadget. So we worked in the lab, making all kinds of measurements on heavy water and electrosonic stuff. And one day I was down to Santa Fe, and I delivered something. They always send us in groups so we wouldn't get too lost. One of the guys wanted to go into a bar, and he did, and we all went in with him. I was sitting there listening to what was going on in the bar. I heard one guy say, I hear they're going to explode that gadget up on the hill. And I didn't really explode the gadget on the hill. So I cut thinking about, you know, they probably are going to test that. And how are they going to test the bomb? You don't get close to an A-bomb and light a fuse, you do it remotely. So the more I thought about that, I was in a kind of a quiet lab, nothing ever seemed to happen. And so I got back, the more I thought about it, I wanted to be involved in this. So, being 20 years old, I walked up top of that office and introduced myself to his secretary. I said, I'd like to see objects. He says, fine. Go ahead, sit down and talk to him. This is the top dog in Los Alamos. I said, I heard that you're going to explode the gadget. You need somebody to explode it with a radio. And I said, what's more, you need somebody with a radio license. And he said, you know, that's probably right. You know anybody with a radio license? I said, well, I'm a licensed operator. I have a commercial license. I have ham licenses. And I'd love to do it. He said, well, maybe we will. We'll talk to you later. He sort of dismissed me. I got downstairs, and he'd had time to call Higginbotham. And I could see they were talking when I went by the office. And they heard the bomb. So, you don't just go and blow up a bomb. First of all, many people are confused. Los Alamos is up in the mountains, as I mentioned, on the volcano. And although we found out on this trip, 50 years later, there was some thoughts about blowing the bomb up at Los Alamos. If they had it, there wouldn't be any Los Alamos, but it was much bigger than they ever thought. They chose a place called Trinity, and I have no idea why. Trinity was a code name to a place on the Alamogordo Desert near White Sands. And they sent us down the desert. Me, another chap named Amy Giordano, going to be important later. Anyway, we lived in a camp, and it was so bad there. It was the first time I've ever seen beer served in the mess hall because there was no water to drink. And we lived there about 30 days making preparations. Now, making preparations was pretty involved. We had a tower 100 feet high, and the bomb would be eventually placed on top of the tower, and we would be 6 miles away in an underground shelter. And the underground shelter
Hold it higher.
Okay, this is the underground shelter. It had a name called South 10,000. That means 6 miles, 10,000 yards is 6 miles. And the whole idea was, you notice this periscope right here, and this is an SCR-299 communications truck owned by the Signal Corps. I finally made it. I got all the other pieces of equipment. And this is yours truly, the day before the blast, posed for pictures. Now, this picture surprised me because we weren't allowed to have cameras. And this guy I worked with, Amy Giordano, I found out had a camera. And he never did tell anybody. He took these pictures, and we set the truck outside of the revetment. And the whole idea was there was 3 of these revetments. North 6 miles, west 6 miles, and south 6 miles. And the camp was about 20 miles farther south. The idea was that we transmit the radio signals from the SCR-299 truck. We had 20 seconds to get out of the truck and run like crazy and get inside the revetment and slam the door shut. Now this sounds dangerous, but we practiced it 30 times before 30 days straight before we pushed the button. We even went through a simulation and piled up 100 tons of dynamite on a great big platform, and we set it off to try to simulate what the A-bomb would do. And that was the biggest explosion ever exploded on the earth by man until that time. Anyway, we practiced this. As you all know, about 3 o'clock on July 16th, 1945, a very unusual storm came up. And all the scientists, the Oppenheimers, and all that group, Groves and Farrell, were in here. The idea was they were going to look at the bomb over the top through this periscope. And the periscope had parallax. It's like these projection TV sets. You get off to the side, the picture isn't very good. But good. And remember, Ames and I were the last two people to get in the shelter, and the shelter was pretty well filled. So we ran, practiced. I mean, I remember casually walking along, and that's too bad, I'm going to miss this. And we would be in the back of the shelter, unable to see through the periscope. As we went in, we must have left the door open a little bit, because we were in the back, and when ground zero, when the bomb went off at ground zero, 6 miles away, there was a blinding light inside the underground shelter just from the crack in the door that was in the opposite direction. We were standing there, you know, thinking we missed it. And I nudged Ames, and he said, let's go. So we crawled on the ground and got this door open and looked around the edge. And all we saw was this picture of this exactly like this. And this was about, it takes 29 seconds for the bomb blast reaches 6 miles of propagation speeds. Anyway, as we looked, we could see the dust cloud coming at us, and we were out of the shelter in about 10 seconds. So we still had maybe 19 seconds of looking to do. Just as we were enjoying ourselves, nobody else was looking at it except us, somebody happened to push the doors open and yelled, my God, we left them soldiers outside. And somebody yelled, hit the dirt. And we fell real fast, and the blast wave passed over us. And we were protected somewhat by this talus on this underground shelter. But we stood up immediately. And there's always two of these blast waves because of things like that. And the second one is about 80% of the first one. That's the one that really flattened us. And even today, I feel a little deafness in this ear because of it. But anyway, this is the way it looked. And had the pleasure a couple, 3 weeks ago walking over the crater where the bomb exploded. And when you walk over the crater, and I'll pass these around, it was so intense that the ground turned to glass. Now, this is some of the glass from the crater. Now, we picked up some a week or so later in the crater, very radioactive. This was picked up 25 years. Sue and I were back there 25 years ago. And we picked this up. I'm going to pass it around. It's called trinitite. And some of the soldiers sent it home, and some of the rock hounds made jewelry out of it for their girlfriends, you know. And they got a pretty bad radioactive burn. I'll pass that. And anyway, you know, here was a bomb that went off. It went off to 23,000 tons of TNT equivalent. And we went back to Los Alamos, jubilant, and wasn't too long that the Enola Gay was on Tinian. That little ham radio story, I keep bringing up ham radio because it played a very important part. World War II had ended. Roosevelt had died. And Harry had said, drop the damn thing. That was very important. Anyway, they let the hams back on 10 meters. That may not mean anything to you, but that's one of the very high frequency HF bands. And we were actually operating our ham radio, talking to people around the world after Germans had given up. They were still fighting the Japanese. We were told, though, not to identify our position. All I could say was, somewhere in New Mexico. And one day we were talking to somebody west, and they said, we're someplace in New Mexico. The guy said, that's strange, we're someplace in the South Pacific. And we knew we had contacted Tinian, where the Enola Gay was at the other end of the island for most of the soldiers. Enola Gay was waiting for good weather to carry the first A-bomb on the city. Now, the bomb we exploded at Trinity is Fat Man. It's a plutonium bomb. And at that time, we had about 10 pounds of plutonium. I found out Los Alamos, we now have 90 tons of plutonium. And what we're going to do with it, we got more we used to have. Anyway, every day we talked to some people in the South Pacific. And we told Oppenheimer that we've got contact with Tinian and we can get you reports. So we talked in vague words. right at the end of the war. We had no doubts whatsoever that the war would be over. Turned out it wasn't. They took a second bomb. Now the second bomb was the plutonium bomb. The one on Hiroshima was a little boy, and it was two pieces of uranium-235 that ran together in a missile-like thing. And the other one is an implosion bomb, where you take a sphere of plutonium and by directive explosives collapse it to the critical size, and that generates the operation of an A-bomb. Well, after Nagasaki, we sort of missed Nagasaki. It's hard to drop an A-bomb. They kind of roll around. We didn't quite hit dead center. And, of course, the war ended. Hirohito commanded the military, and I just found this out, that the Army weren't going to give up even after 2 A-bombs. Hirohito, being a humanitarian and a god at that time, directed Japan to give up and capitulate. And that's what happened. At Los Alamos, we were out of a job. I was still in the military. I was a sergeant at that time. And all these famous scientists were running around, sort of out of a job too. Kind of ruined the whole thing for us. At Los Alamos, I went to work every morning on this motorcycle. It was an Army cycle. The Army decided to dump all their cycles out in the middle of the war. And Enrico Fermi, who got the first atomic pile going, the Italian, in Chicago, under the stadium, he rode a bicycle. All these guys were athletes. So every morning, we'd pedal up the hill, take the rays on top of the hill. I'd zoom by my motorcycle and wave at him, and always beat him to the hill. And one morning I hit an ice slick, and I slipped out from under me, and I fell splat, and that morning he beat me. Anyway, he always laughed about that. So, we thought it'd be great to have him teach us a course. So, all during the winter of 45 and 46, he taught us nuclear physics. We were pretty worried about getting out of the service. It was February 1946. Most of you guys were coming home or had been home. You had all these points. Here we were at Los Alamos with no points except time. We've been there about 3 years. So they got the idea they were going to blow up the Navy. They took 100 ships out to Bikini and put them in a big circle and blow them up. Except that nobody wanted to go. Well, again, I was a volunteer, and I went up and been trying every way to get out of the service. I went up and talked to Oppenheimer again. He said, "Would you like to go, Mr. Miller, or Sergeant Miller?" I said, "I sure would, if you let me out of the service." So he picked up the phone, called Fort Bliss, and I was a civilian again. We went out to Bikini. We took 3 bombs, and the first one was an airdrop headed for the Nevada. And it didn't do much damage. And by the way, I haven't passed this around. This is a piece of roof tile from Hiroshima. It shows the intense heat. Anybody on the bridge in the middle of Hiroshima, their silhouette was burned into the steel bridge. It shows here how the heat burned this tile. I forgot, right from Hiroshima. Anyway, the first bomb in the summer of 46 was dropped on the Nevada, and we did exactly the same thing we did at Trinity. We took the bomb out. We were 20 miles away this time. It wasn't quite our show. The Navy ran this one. The Army ran the other one. And the Navy wanted to make this a big show place. And they brought 50,000 people out of Bikini. And even Secretary of the Navy Forrestal was there. I don't know what happened to Forrestal. I went home to the window. But anyway, our job was to deliver the bomb and to explode the bomb. Exactly. We had the airplane drop the bomb, didn't do much damage. Then we put one in a bathysphere and hung it below a ship. And this one sunk all the ships, including the aircraft carriers and the submarines and the Japanese ship Nagato. Just before it sank, we allowed the hams to do scrounging. Now, a souvenir hunting. Everybody wanted a souvenir. They always wanted souvenirs. So several of us hams were given a few hours to go aboard these ships that we're doing and to pick up anything you find. What we got was amateur radio equipment, meters and dials and knobs and stuff. Anyway, we happened to be on a ship Nagato, and I remembered Mrs. the last time I saw those gun barrels until the other night on TV. They're doing diving out of Bikini now, and you know, a couple of those divers sit on those gun barrels. It's fascinating. So those gun barrels, they're about this big around. The bore is this big. They're tremendous. Well, that's about the whole story. You'll see some of the souvenirs that I picked up in these travels. Remember, I was just a kid back home, married Sue when I was 22, and we went to school for years and years and years and years. What it did, when we had a chance to check up on everybody, we had a reunion 3 weeks ago at Los Alamos. A lot of people came back. All of the big shots, the Fermis, the Oppenheimers, had long since died. My boss, Higginbotham, and a couple of others were still there in wheelchairs, not walking very good. And we talked about those days, how inspiring they were. And we were just soldiers, not very well educated. None of us had college degrees. We had these STP things. But everybody we knew, Father was a Nobel Prize winner. Can you imagine being in a laboratory and they say, yeah, Dad won that back in 45, I guess, or 43, I don't know. You know, they talk about Nobel Prizes like you guys talk about basketball games. And we got the feeling that nobody was worth anything unless they had a PhD. And that's just the way everybody turned out. They came home and they like never quit going to school until they got that PhD. And we reviewed that back at Los Alamos. It was sort of fun getting back and talking about this. Only at Los Alamos could you walk down the street. Sue and I are walking down this sidewalk. We saw this old guy hobbling towards us with a cane. I said, Sue, there goes Edward Teller, the inventor of the hydrogen bomb. So with that, I'll stop talking. If there's any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. Yes.
Don, I graduated in 43, and I still got my physics handbook, and it says in there the atom is too small to a particle too small to divide.
Well, they found out differently, didn't they? Yeah, that's what the big experiment in Chicago was about. Can you break the atom, you know? And, you know, it's well known now that it'll eventually be our entire power source on Earth. As soon as we get rid of the Jane Fondas and that type of person, we'll be building atomic power plants in every county in the United States. That's the way it has to go. Build one in every county seat in the United States, nobody will claim that you're being discriminated against. All the extra heat, you can keep the court free. And one of the assignments that Fermi assigned us is how many nuclear power plants we have to build in the world to completely power the world forever. It wasn't very many, I don't remember the exact number, something like 50. And so, for the last man, I think nuclear power is the way to go. All we got from the Russians is a nuclear engine to go to Mars. We go to Mars with a nuclear engine in 240 days. If we don't have the nuclear engine, it'll take us 2.5 years. So the United States is dynamited in nuclear engines. Their exploration of Mars is coming. Any other questions? Yeah.
We know that Germany was a little bit ahead of us in the physical armament. The hard water plant that they had there in Finland.
Right.
What is the difference in them and the atomic?
Well, hard water is made out of deuterium, which is different. Water is H2O, 2 hydrogen or oxygen. The hydrogen has some extra particles, extra electrons, and extra nucleus and so forth. It's deuterium. Deuterium is called heavy water, and it acts as a barrier so that there's neutrons, and you want to slow these neutrons down. They're like protons, except they have no charge. They use heavy water to slow them down so that the uranium will have time to react with it. It's hard to get a reaction going. That's what it is for. If you find heavy water anywhere in the world, you better check up on it, because there's only one use for it. That's building an H bomb, or an atomic bomb, and an H bomb. The atomic bomb is the fuse on the H bomb. You shouldn't be afraid of H bombs because you see one every day. It's called the sun. It's a continuously operating H bomb.
was the nature of your day-to-day work at Los Alamos?
Just like I did in naval avionics for 30 years after that.
What was that?
Well, it was sort of a shock. You know, you go to naval avionics and the laboratories are just filled full of exotic equipment. All your taxpayers and me included pay for it. I remember my boss used to go ahead and say, I got to have this cathode ray oscilloscope, and I'll cost $50,000. He said, fine, better order 2 of them. Might break sometime. That was a little bit like Los Alamos. But it wasn't quite that easy. The first job that Willie assigned me was to build an oscilloscope. And everybody knows what an oscilloscope is. The green worm you see in a radio service place. But this was a particular kind. It was what's called a driven sweep oscilloscope. And you couldn't buy them. And he assigned every engineer to build his own. It took about 2 weeks to build it. Because all of the great developments that happened there wasn't any commercial industry outside. Everything happened in Los Alamos. Everything, the calculator, the computer, all originated in Los Alamos. And all, with 150 of the top scientists in the world there, you'd expect great things to happen. And so our day-to-day work, I worked on a bench, I worked on heavy water, I worked on fusing the bomb. That man has lenses which collapse on this plutonium. And we screwed in 32 champion spark plugs into the top of the lens so that when the spark plugs were ignited, the fusing would burn in at a constant rate and the shock wave would squeeze the ball symmetrically so it wouldn't squirt out and be a fizzle. That was a real job. I worked on the distribution of the sparks. So all 32 spark plugs would get the same spark in less than a microsecond. I remember we bought the entire production of Champion one time. You know, hundreds and hundreds of sparks. We were trying to find 32 of them that were alike. That's all we want, 32 of them that were alike. And we, when the 6AK52 was a very famous gold grid tetrode pentode tube you used to have in your TV sets in the front end. And these were very valuable tubes. Remember, you could buy a tube for nearly nothing in World War II if you could find them. I mean, it didn't cost much, these weren't being made. Willie told me to go over to S-Talk one time and get some 6AK5s. And I remember they gave me a little box of them about this big. The guy said, be careful of that, that's $50,000 worth of vacuum tubes. So, another guy went over and he wanted a piece of metal for his coffee maker. He'd broken something, you know, the screen. So I went over to S-Talk and got a piece of metal. And several years later, months later, somebody looked at it and said, you know, that looks like a pretty good piece of metal. It was a piece of platinum. Things were very critical. I learned at Los Alamos that they took a lot of the silver and made silver wire out of it to use at Oak Ridge in some of the fusion plants and stuff. Because they go back later. One final story, and while we were there, they told us all about the spies. And my supply sergeant was Greenglass, Sergeant Greenglass. Greenglass was the brother-in-law of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. You all know what happened to Rosenberg. They were executed by Truman, and without divulging too much of what went on. Greenglass got kind of a reprieve, got 10 years, and changed his name. He's still around, though. The Rosenberg kids were raised by a neighbor, and they weren't paid, their education wasn't paid for by the government either. Anyway, since the Russians are so obliging today, we were allowed to go through the KGB files and found out what the Rosenbergs took. It turned out that Greenglass got very little. He made one sketch of Fat Man, and that's all that was ever transmitted. But they found hundreds of secret documents from Los Alamos in the KGB files that Rosenbergs hadn't transmitted. And when they told that, they said, look around. We've never caught that spy that took 100 pages of data. He may be here in the room today. That sort of left everybody with chills. That's the story of Los Alamos. It's a great place today. Los Alamos scientists are wondering what to do now that the wars are over and we'll all live in peace forever. And one of the things they're going to do is try to make a complete record of the DNA of the human being. The DNA is what makes you look like somebody else or not look like somebody else. And it's a way of tagging the human being. And they're very optimistic. They have the biggest computer in the world. During the making of the A-bomb, they had a girl doing calculations on a punch board like that. They now can do 1,000 billion calculations per second at Los Alamos. 1,000 billion. It's 10 to the 12th. And they're thinking about mapping the human being. And the idea is certain of us have defects. Why do certain people get cancer? You see it around families. If they can find out where the defects in you are, you know, they might be able to fix you up ahead of time. And this is what Los Alamos thinks their future will be, checking DNA from people. They'll also find out if you're related to the money. Money has DNA too. You get a little of this if you read see the movie Jurassic Park. That's enough.
What times we live in now, the 50-year anniversary of the celebration of the end of World War II. The other night I talked to Don at Moscow Festival, and I said, what was one of your fears when you exploded the atomic bomb might have been it would set off a chain reaction in the atmosphere and everything would go. And I mentioned that they had side bets going on that would happen. How would you win? But anyway, thanks again, Don and Marion. I appreciate you coming out tonight to our second World War II Nostalgia Night. And don't forget, July the 12th, we'll be here again. We have two good speakers. And if you'd like to stick around a little bit, if Don's got a little time, Marion's got a lot of time, we have the displays. Any questions you might have, feel free to address. We have some coffee left and some cookies. Thanks to you. And, thanks everyone for coming. See you. Appreciate it. Yes, Rex?
Any World War II veterans want to see if they're listed, or find out now.
June 30th is the last.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
It's reasonably realistic. They don't deviate that trip too much. They leave out a lot of other things you did.
Yeah, that's a new one, yeah. Just to walk around.
I'm fine, how are you? You know what?